Hello, everybody. Welcome to session number 5 on human tissues. Remember, on the first and second sessions, we were talking about how things are organized, and we talked about molecules, and we talked about how the molecules can come together to make the cell parts, and then the cell parts can come together to make the cells. And we talked about that last week. Now, the cells themselves are alive, but they can work together too. There's things that groups of cells can do that one cell cannot. For example, pulling up your arm with your bicep muscle. You don't want just one cell in that muscle to do that. It couldn't in a million years be able to do it. But you have thousands or millions of cells in there, and they all work together as a team to be able to lift up your forearm when you flex your arm. So those are tissues. Tissues are cells that work as a team, similar cells that work as a team. Now, just one reminder, keep an eye on your email, and also keep an eye on the announcements in Blackboard, and watch out for deadlines, because some of you have been a little bit on the late side for some of those assignments. There is going to be another one this week, so keep an eye on it, okay? Now, for today, for tissues, I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to go through the slides and learn about tissues. And then we'll be all set for this week. Now, believe it or not, in the human body, there are only 4 different tissues, 4 different types. One type is called epithelium. Epithelium is basically a tissue that's made of cells, almost like a sheet that covers and lines things. It's kind of like the paint on the outside of your house, or the paint on the inside of your rooms that's covering and lining your house. Epithelium is a covering and lining tissue. Connective tissue, obviously, it tells you what it is. It's very strong tissue. There are exceptions to that, and we'll talk about that as we go along. And it's a tough tissue that, in a sense, kind of holds you together. Muscle tissue allows you to move, clearly, and nervous tissue controls everything. Your brain would not be able to control your body if it wasn't all wired with nerves. And so the nervous tissue makes up the nerves. So we're going to talk about each one of those 4, mostly epithelium and connective today, because we're going to have a whole session later on muscle, and another whole session on nerve later on in the year. So we're going to concentrate today on epithelium and connective, with just a little bit on muscles and nervous tissue. Now we go to the next slide, some of the characteristics of epithelium. Now, as I said, epithelium by and large is covering and lining tissue. It covers organs and lines cavities. So the inside of your stomach obviously is hollow, and it's lined by epithelium. The hollow intestines is lined with epithelium. Even your heart inside, where the blood flows through it, is lined with epithelium. The cells are attached to each other. They look kind of like puzzle pieces that are all put together to make a flat sort of mat. And that could be used to wrap around things, or to line inside of hollow things. If the epithelium tissue is only 1 cell thick, very, very thin, probably couldn't even see it without a microscope, then they call that simple epithelium. But in some parts of your body, 1 cell thick isn't good enough. It'll wear out. So in some places where it has to take a beating, you want it to be stratified. Stratified means that the epithelium is many cells thick. And we'll talk about some examples of that as we go along. Epithelium has no blood vessels in it. It gets nourishment from the materials in tissues below it that sort of diffuse into the cells from there. There's no blood vessels in epithelium. There's no nerves in epithelium either, but some of the connective tissues underneath the epithelium in your body may have nerves in it, and some of those nerve endings can pop up into the epithelium a little bit. But there's no real nerves going through the epithelium. A basement membrane, now if you have a covering or a lining, you want it to somehow be attached to the thing it's covering or lining, and that's the basement membrane. So for example, if you have a vinyl siding on the outside of your house, it has to be attached to your house, otherwise it would fall off. And so the basement membrane is a protein. It's not really a membrane. It's a protein sort of glue that cements the epithelium cells, the covering and lining cells of your organs and your body, to the tissues beneath it. Sometimes that basement membrane is damaged, or the protein isn't made properly, and people who have that issue really have a problem with their skin actually literally peeling off, because your outer skin is epithelium, and there has to be a glue that holds that onto the connective tissue underneath it. But most of us, that glue works pretty well, and your skin stays on you. Um, Lots of Golgi, and if you remember, Golgi is a organelle that has to do with secretion. Things are made in the Golgi, they're moved around in little membrane-bounded spheres or vesicles inside the cell, and then it's let out of the cell. And it makes sense that if epithelium is lining something, like lining, let's say, your trachea, that is a tube that goes down into your lungs. If the epithelium is lining that, you want the epithelium to produce mucus. So the mucus will keep the trachea sticky, so that when you breathe in dust and dirt and grime and all those things in the air, and bacteria, viruses, whatever, they have a tough time getting all the way into your lungs, because they'll stick onto the trachea because there's mucus there. And there are little cilia, little hair-like structures that beat that mucus up toward your throat. So when you swallow all those bad things into your stomach, and none of it actually gets into your lungs. So you want the epithelium to be able to produce a lot of secretions. Your stomach lining produces your stomach juices, so that you can digest your food better. Your intestinal lining, epithelium cells produce the juices that help you digest your food there. So a lot of Golgi means that it's going to be able to secrete materials to the outside of the cell into the cavity that it's lining. And a couple of other things about epithelium is that the cells are able to regenerate rapidly. And that makes sense, because they have to be able to do mitosis, or cell replication, very fast, because they keep falling off. You lose your stomach lining every few days, and you have to constantly replace it. And so you're always making new cells. It's always replacing itself. Your skin cells is falling off, and you have to replace those. So the cells are constantly being produced to replace the cells that fall off. You know that if you're covering something or lining something, one side of your paint in your house is attached to your house, but the other side is open to the elements. Same thing with paint on the inside of your rooms. So eventually it gets peeling or damaged, and it has to be scraped off or replaced. Well, the same thing is true for epithelium. These cells, since they're lining something, one side of them is always exposed to either a cavity or to the outside world. And so they're either falling off or being destroyed or whatever, and they constantly need to be replaced. So they're doing lots and lots of mitosis. In fact, most cancers, which is basically mitosis out of control, cells that can't stop replicating and create a tumor, are cancers that that came from epithelium cells. Now, epithelium is classified in your body by its shape. Some of the cells are called squamous cells, and that word means flat. They're very flat, almost like a coin or a poker chip, or maybe the scale of a fish, that kind of shape. Thin, flat cells in one layer. If it's only in one layer, remember, that means it's simple. Now, there's many, many places in your body where there is simple squamous flat cells, one cell thick, that either cover or line something, or actually form a structure inside of your body. I'm only going to give you an example of 3 of them, and those are the only 3 you're going to have to know for a quiz or for a worksheet. The one is the air sacs of your lungs. Your lungs are not one big hollow bag. There's many, many millions of little teeny little lungs in there, little balloons made of one cell thick, simple epithelium cells. Very, very fragile. And those little balloons are called air sacs. And every time you breathe in, you fill up the air sacs with air, millions of them in each lung. Around the air sacs, there are blood vessels, and so the oxygen diffuses across the cell membranes of the air sacs and into the blood. And the carbon dioxide from the blood diffuses back into the air sacs, and you get to breathe them out. So this is an example where epithelium is not actually used as a covering or lining. It's actually creating a structure inside of your lungs. All those little air sacs, which are so delicate and so easily damaged by things like cigarette smoke and pollution, are made of one cell thick, flat little epithelium cells that have to fill with air and have the blood vessels around them to gather the oxygen and get rid of the CO2. The peritoneum is the lining of your body cavity. The ventral body cavity, remember, is the largest one in your body. It has all your organs, like your stomach and your intestines and your liver and your pancreas and all of those things that are underneath your diaphragm. All the organs in the lower part of your body cavity. The peritoneum lines that. It's only one cell thick, and it lines the whole body cavity of your body, the abdominal region. It can get infected, especially with women, because women have an open sort of way to get the bacteria and viruses and things into their body cavity through their reproductive system. And so what happens sometimes if a woman, say, is having a baby, and whoever the midwife is or whoever it was, especially in the early 1800s, 1700s, and even earlier, didn't use sterile technique or clean hands, the bacteria can work its way up into her body cavity and literally grow on the lining of her body cavity, the lining of her abdomen. That's called a peritoneum, one cell thick, simple epithelium cells. And they can actually grow there like they were growing on a petri dish. And then the woman would get sicker and sicker and sicker, high fever, and die. And so many, many women died in childbirth after they had the baby because they got infected. The peritoneum, the lining of the body cavity, got bacteria growing on it. The interior of your heart and blood vessels is lined in one cell thick, simple epithelium cells. And in a few slides, you'll see what these cells actually look like. A lymph vessel is kind of like a blood vessel. You have another type of fluid that flows around in your body besides blood, and that's called lymph. And we'll talk about that one a little bit later on in the year as well. But there are lymph vessels, and the lymph vessels actually are also lined on the inside with one cell thick epithelium to make it nice and smooth inside for the blood and the lymph to flow through. It would be like if your pipes in your house were lined on the inside with, let's say, something very, very slippery and easy for the water to go through it. The stratified squamous means that the cells are flat. That's what squamous means, but they're many cells thick. And so that means that they are going to be maybe 5, 10, maybe even 30, 40 cells thick. The epidermis of your skin, the outer layer of your skin, is stratified squamous epithelium. And the outer layers are actually dead, and they fall off of your body all the time and literally create most of the dust in your house. Inside of those cells on your skin, there's a protein called keratin. And though that keratin makes the skin waterproof. So that means the water inside your body, which is, remember, 70-75% of your body's water, cannot evaporate out through your skin. Many burn victims have issues with dehydration because they burned away the keratinized epidermis, which prevents the water from evaporating out of their bodies. In some parts of your body, you have stratified squamous cells that are covering something or lining something, and then they don't have the keratin in them, and they are called non-keratinized, and they were the ones that line the inside of your mouth. If you scrape the inside of your mouth with a stick, you can actually put it on a slide and look at those cells under a microscope. Your esophagus, which is the tube that leads down into your stomach, is also lined on the inside with many layers of stratified squamous epithelium, because it has to take a beating. You're swallowing solid food, and it scrapes the esophagus every time it goes down into your stomach and takes off some of those cells. So the esophagus has to be many cells thick. The epithelium lining of the esophagus has to be many cells thick in order to regenerate the cells that it's losing when the food goes through it. And the vagina, of course, also needs to have a stratified squamous epithelium lining for two reasons, and also for the esophagus. Many Golgi, because it makes lots of juices and things that lubricate it, but also to prevent it from losing all the cells when the woman is having sex. We go to the next one, and we have cuboidal shape. Now, the cuboidal shaped cells are cube shaped, just like a dice or a sugar cube or something like that. And your glands are actually made of cuboidal epithelium. They are very soft and mushy, and they have very little connective tissue in them for strength. And inside the glands, you have layers of these cuboidal epithelium cells that form inside them. Lots and lots and lots of Golgi, so that whatever the gland is producing can leave the cells and get into the blood or become tears in your eyes or mucus in your nose or mucus in your throat, or stomach health, digestive juices or whatever it is. You need to realize that your glands are actually made of these simple layers, folded layers of simple cuboidal cells that are inside the gland, and they're producing things like insulin and thyroid hormones and pituitary hormones and all of those kinds of things. Not only, and then outside things could be sweat and think that, and milk, even if you're a girl making milk for a baby. Inside of your kidneys, you have many tubes, little tubes that is used to make the urine and produce the urine and let it leave the kidney. Those kidney tubules are very fragile. They're only made of one cell thick cube-shaped epithelium cells. That's why the kidney is so easy to damage. Again, here's an example where the epithelium is not covering and lining something. It's actually producing these little tubes inside of the kidneys. The surface of a girl's ovary is covered with a layer of simple cuboidal epithelium cells as well. There's no hole for the egg to come out, so the egg literally has to explode out every month. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the reproductive system later. Stratified cuboidal is kind of unusual in the body. They're cube-shaped cells, more than one cell thick. And the ducts of your sweat glands, now your sweat glands in your skin have little tubes that lead up to the skin. Those tubes are called ducts, D-U-C-T. And they are made of cuboidal epithelium cells, which are more than one cell thick. And believe it or not, the mammary glands inside of a woman's breast are also modified sweat glands. And so that the ducts that lead from the glands there are also made of the same thing, stratified cuboidal epithelium. They just make some sweat, but when the woman has a baby, they're modified to produce milk. And the last shape of epithelium is simple columnar. Columnar means column-shaped. If it's simple, it's a single one layer of cells, elongated, like a column. Very common in your digestive system. The interior of your stomach and your entire intestines, many feet, are lined in one cell thick simple columnar epithelium cells. And they make the juices that help you digest your food. There's some goblet cells included in them. Those are modified columnar cells, which are modified to produce the mucus. That's why your stomach has so much mucus in it, and your intestines too. So the food and waste and things like that can move like lubricated through your digestive system. Now, sometimes columnar-shaped cells can have cilia. Cilia are those little wiggly, hair-like structures that are on the cell's edges. If it's ciliated columnar, that means that they're usually found lining a tube that needs to move in something in the tube. So, for example, in a woman, there's oviducts or fallopian tubes, which are lined in ciliated columnar epithelium cells. That cilia literally pushes the egg, especially if it's fertilized egg, toward the uterus, so the baby can develop in the uterus and not in the tube. If that cilia wasn't there, a lot of times the baby the egg is fertilized in the tube, and if the cilia wasn't there, it would grow as a baby in the tube and kill the baby and the mom. She would bleed to death. So that cilia, which is on the edge of those columnar cells lining her tube, is actually pushing that egg into the uterus, where it can develop into a baby safely. Stratified columnar, many layer cells of columnar-shaped cells. They're usually on the edges of your digestive system. Things like your pharynx is your throat. Stratified columnar cells are in there. Of course, they take a beating every time you swallow something. So you want it to be more than one cell thick lining there. The same thing with the anus and the urethra, as male and female. Uh, if when you pee, you actually knock off some of those cells. And if you looked at urine under the microscope, you'd actually see little sort of rectangular shaped cells floating around in your urine. That was the columnar cells that were lining your urethra, the tube that you pee through. So you want to make that to be stratified so that there'll be more than one cell thick, so they can easily be replaced. The epiglottis is a little flap that covers the top of your trachea when you swallow. It's very, very important, because if you didn't have that, everything that you ate or drank would be poured down into your lungs, and you would easily drown or just choke to death. Your epiglottis closes the top of the trachea, the tube that leads to your lungs, when you swallow, and forces the food or drink down into your esophagus instead, so it goes into the stomach. That epiglottis is made of tough connective tissue, which we'll talk about in a little bit in a minute, and it's covered in stratified columnar epithelium cells. Remember, epithelium is a covering and lining tissue. And we get to a few other pictures here. This is what simple squamous looks like. One cell thick layer of cells, and it's very fragile. This is what's lining your peritoneum, the body cavity on the inside of your abdomen. Stratified squamous, here, that's the epidermis of your skin. Simple cuboidal here, you see it's only one cell thick, cuboidal cells, and it's not very, very thick at all. And they are making the kidney tubules and other structures that we talked about. Stratified cuboidal, again, those are the ones that are inside the ducts that lead from your sweat glands and mammary glands into your skin. Simple columnar, this is the ones that look like columns, and they are lining your intestine and stomach and produce the juices that help you digest your food. Stratified columnar is the ones in your throat, in your anus, and your vagina, and the places like that where it needs to be more than one cell thick. The lining of those things. Then we get to a very interesting one, the last thing about epithelium. There's a kind of epithelium tissue called pseudostratified ciliated columnar. Now, columnar means obviously they're columns. Ciliated means it has the cilia on the edge, so they can wiggle back and forth and create a current in a tube. And pseudostratified means that the cells are kind of flopping over each other. So it looks like it's more than one cell thick, but it really is only one cell thick. So they call it pseudostratified. I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. The taller cells, as you see, overlap the shorter ones, but they all touch that basement membrane under it. So only the taller cells have the cilia. The lining of the trachea and your bronchial tubes, the tubes that lead into your lungs, are pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. They save your life every time you swallow something, or every time you breathe, I should say. The dust in the air is loaded with bacteria and viruses, particles, dirt, you name it. All of that's trying to get into your lungs. And so the lining of the trachea, made of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium cells, lots of Golgi, creates all that mucus that is always there in your lining your trachea, catching the little particles that you breathe in every breath. So that prevents them from getting into the lungs. The bronchial tubes are branches of the trachea that go into the actual lungs. In a man, the vas deferens is the tube that leads from the testes to the penis to allow the sperm to come through. It is also lined in pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium to help the sperm move through. And your eustachian tube is the tube that leads from your throat to the other side of your eardrum. So that if you have pressure pushing against your eardrum, like if you're on an airplane or something like that, and your ear gets pushed in a bit, you can open your mouth, chew gum, and you can get that same pressure going up through the tube to push that eardrum on the other side back to its normal shape. A lot of, especially children, get throat infections, and because the tube from the throat goes right up to the inside of the eardrum in the middle ear, you can get an ear infection as well. Transitional epithelium means that the epithelium changes its shape on you. So you can't call it cuboidal, you can't call it columnar, you can't call it squamous, because it changes. And there's only really one important place where that happens, and that's in your urinary bladder. Because when the bladder is empty, the cells look more cuboidal in shape that line the inside of the bladder. But when the bladder is full, it stretches so much that the cells get stretched and they look flat. And so it can change shape from, let's say, cuboidal to squamous. And so they just simply call it transitional. Now that's epithelium. Here's some pictures. Well, before we get to the pictures, we have a couple of things about glands. Remember, your glands are also made of mostly epithelium. You have two types of glands. You have endocrine glands and you have exocrine glands. Endocrine glands are ones that have no duct at all. They're just masses of folded up simple cuboidal epithelium cells that have lots of Golgi and produce hormones. And the hormones are put directly into your bloodstream. They're internal. Exocrine glands have ducts or tubes through which something flows. The gland that produces something from its Golgi, the epithelium cells have lots of Golgi, and the Golgi produces something, and it goes up through the duct to the epithelial surface, usually the skin or something like that. And so what happens is that's the sweat glands or the oil glands that are on your hair, or the tear glands in your eyes, or the glands that make the mucus in your nose. All of those are exocrine glands because the things that they make are produced to the outside of the body. Sweat glands and oil glands are good examples of those. Now, what do they look like? This is what pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium looks like. You see the cells are columnar shape, but they kind of overlap each other. So it looks like it's stratified, looks like it's more than one cell thick, but it really is only one cell thick. Here's the basement membrane under there. That's actually that glue that holds it on to the tissue below it. Up here is the cilia, and that's constantly beating, like it looks like grass, and it's constantly going back and forth. And if this was inside of your trachea, lining the tube, it would be pushing up that mucus, which would be laden with all the bad materials that you're breathing in. So now you can swallow it into your stomach acid instead of getting it into your lungs. Okay, these are probably the goblet cells that are making the mucus right here. And in the gland, you have the exocrine glands, and you see the duct, the material that these cells are making. These are cuboidal epithelium cells, is being produced to the outside of the world, outside here, and it could be sweat. It could be just covering your skin with sweat. It could be tears, whatever. And this is an endocrine gland, and you can see these are one cell thick cuboidal cells that are producing the hormones. And this white stuff around it here, those are blood vessels, and those hormones going directly into the blood vessels. That would be things like insulin, or thyroid hormone, growth hormone, even the sex hormones. And so that would be the endocrine glands, all epithelium. Now we go to another type of tissue. Another type of tissue is called connective tissue. And kind of funny about that, because the word connective kind of indicates that the cells are connected, but they're not. One of the hallmarks of a connective tissue is that the cells are far apart from each other, and they are not connected. If you look at it, it says cells are not connected to each other, but they're embedded in some kind of a protein matrix. It's kind of like a really thick, super thick jello, almost like a rubber, thick jello. And the cells are embedded in that. And one type of cell that's embedded in there is called a fibroblast. And what that does, it produces fibers, very strong protein fibers that populate inside of that jelly that the cells are in. The cells are far apart from each other, and then in between them, you have that thick jello with all these fibers in it that the fibroblasts have produced. One of the fibers is called collagen, and collagen is the most common protein in your body, and that gives the connective tissue its strength. If the connective tissue was just made of cells, it would fall apart. It wouldn't be strong enough. It's just cell membranes. But if the collagen fibers are all intertwined between the cells, it's kind of like a cotton ball. It makes it really difficult to rip. and so the connective tissue gets its strength from the fibers of collagen that are in between the cells embedded in that jelly. Elastin is another fiber that these cells make, and the fiber of elastin can stretch and then boing back. It's almost like a rubber band, and that gives the connective tissue its ability to stretch and then return back to its regular shape. The areolar connective tissue and adipose connective tissue are both a type of connective tissue called loose. Areolar connective tissue is the kind, it's kind of cells are far apart, lots of fibroblasts. There's maybe some cells in your immune system embedded in there as well to help you fight disease. And that's usually found underneath the layers of epithelium that are covering and lining things. The epithelium itself is very, very fragile and easily broken up. So you want to have that strength. So it's kind of like a puzzle. You know, if you make a puzzle of 1,000 pieces, it takes you a long time to put it together, and you put all the pieces together, that would be a 1 cell thick epithelium. But you wouldn't want to just pick that up and put it on the wall, because the puzzle would just fall apart. In order for you to actually give it some strength, you have to put something under it, like a piece of wood or maybe a cardboard, and then even some glue to glue the pieces onto it. So that would be a good example of these kinds of membranes that are inside your body, which are covering and lining things, especially the like the peritoneum and the covering around the stomach and the lining of the stomach. They have connective tissues, loose connective tissue, this areolar kind of connective tissue underneath the epithelium, and it's held together by the basement membrane, which is the glue. So it's very much like a puzzle on your wall. The pieces would be the epithelium, the glue would be the basement membrane holding it on, and then the wood or the strong cardboard would be the connective tissue underneath to hold it all together for you, so it doesn't fall apart. A good place to find areolar connective tissue, other than underneath all the places where you have covering and lining, is the dermis of your skin. And that makes sense because the epidermis is epithelium. It's stratified squamous epithelium cells. Underneath the epidermis is the areolar connective tissue to hold it and give it strength, and then the basement membrane is holding it together. So your skin is kind of like that puzzle as well, except that the pieces would be more than 1 cell thick in the epidermis. The dermis would be the connective tissue underneath the epidermis to give it strength and support. So your skin is really 2 layers. You have the epidermis on top, which is the epithelium cells that are constantly being sloughed off and being produced over and over again to replace them. They have the basement membrane under that to kind of glue it on to the dermis underneath. The dermis underneath is that nice, strong areolar loose connective tissue. Now, don't let that word loose fool you. Loose doesn't mean weak. It just means it's not as strong as the ones under that. Adipose tissue is also cells that are far apart from each other, and they have some collagen and elastin fibers in between them as well. But the cell has a big vacuole in it. And remember, we said vacuoles are used to store things. And the vacuole in the adipose tissue cells have fat in them, or triglycerides in them. And the more you eat that you don't use, your body will simply store that energy as fat and make those cells get bigger and bigger, and also make your waist get bigger and bigger because of that. If you're on a diet, though, you can feed upon the fat in the adipose cells and lose weight. Now, fibrous connective tissue is the same thing as loose, except there's a lot more collagen in it, and elastin embedded in that protein material, that jelly. Very, very strong, almost impossible to rip. Collagen, strand for strand, is stronger than steel. If you had a piece of steel the same thickness as a strand of collagen and you pulled on it, the steel would break first. Ligaments and tendons are made of what they call regular fibrous connective tissue. The fibers are kind of parallel to each other in there with cells in between. Almost impossible to rip it. The dermis of your skin not only has the areolar loose connective tissue in it, but it also has a certain amount of what they call irregular fibrous connective tissue too. And that gives the dermis even more strength to hold your skin on and hold it together for you. The elastic tissue, elastic connective tissue, is the same thing as loose, except that instead of having a lot of collagen fibers, it has a lot of elastin fibers. So that makes it very stretchy and boingy, and it'll go back and forth if you stretch it. And that's where the type of tissue that surrounds all those little air sacs in your lungs. Remember, the air sacs were made of 1 cell thick squamous epithelium little bags that actually fill up with air when you breathe in. And the lungs are then filled around all those with elastic connective tissue for strength and also to allow it to stretch. And then we get to a couple of pictures here. Here's the loose connective tissue. You see the cells are far apart. This is probably a fibroblast here. These are probably cells in your immune system. All this white stuff is that jelly. It's a thick jelly material. And these are the fibers. There's collagen fibers and elastin fibers in there. Hard to rip. This one is the regular fibers. These are the ones in your ligaments and tendons. Lots of collagen fibers sort of in a parallel way. Cells here and there in between. Almost impossible to rip because collagen is so strong. Irregular fibers could also be in it's very similar to the loose connective tissue, except it has a lot more collagen in it and it makes it harder to rip it. And some of that's in your dermis as well. And finally, you have the adipose cells. These are the ones that have these large vacuoles. And the vacuoles are filled with triglyceride fat. And so as you eat, as I say, too much, and you don't use it for energy, you're going to store. These are going to get bigger, and and I said your waist will get bigger with it. There's blood vessels in here and nerve cells. In fact, one thing about connective tissue, all these connective tissues, all of them have blood vessels flowing through them and nerves. So when you feel something, it's almost always your connective tissue that feels it. And there's lots and lots of blood vessels in connective tissue too. If you put a needle in your skin and don't go very deep, you can't feel it. You almost sew your fingers together and you can't feel it if you don't put the needle very deeply into your skin, because that's only in the epidermis. And remember, epidermis has no blood vessels or nerves. But if you went a little too deep just once and you felt a little pain, means that your needle went down into the dermis, and the dermis has loose connective and irregular fibrous connective tissue in it, both of which have blood vessels flowing through it and nerves. And that's when you'll see the little drop of blood and feel the pain. Now we go to the next picture here, or the next slide. And now we said connective tissue is tissue where the cells are not connected. Well, your blood cells are not connected either. They're just flowing around inside your plasma. The plasma is the liquid portion of your blood, and the blood cells are flowing in there. And because the cells are not connected, and there's sort of a matrix between them, in the sense of blood, it would be a fluid matrix instead of a jelly. It's connective tissue. We say that blood is connective tissue because in between the blood cells, the plasma liquid portion of the blood, which is actually a light yellow, the red blood cells are floating in that, and they're not connected. So we say that the erythrocytes, or red blood cells, are floating in a liquid matrix of plasma, and so therefore it's classified as a connective tissue. Lymph, as I told you, is also a fluid that flows through your body, and again we'll talk about its functions later. But they also have cells, and the cells in the lymph liquid that's flowing through it are called lymphocytes, and they're very, very important white blood cells that actually help you get better when you're sick. Both of those have cells floating in a fluid. The cells are not connected, so that they are classified as connective tissues. Now, the last thing about connective tissue, some of the connective tissues are actually, in a sense, solid. The matrix between the cells is so hard that it actually, in the case of cartilage, it actually feels like a pencil eraser or a piece of rubber. Or in the case of bone, it's actually like rock. So what happens here is that cartilage is made of cells called chondrocytes. Chondro is a prefix that means cartilage, and cyte means cell. So chondrocytes are cartilage cells. Inside your body, you have this these little pads of cartilage. Now, cartilage is made of chondrocytes not connected to each other, hence their connective tissue. And in between them is a really, really thick, super thick protein matrix, rubbery, in fact, this close to being solid. You can bend it just like a pencil eraser. And the cells are inside little holes called lacunae inside this rubbery matrix. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. The cartilage feels no pain. This is an exception to the rule. Connective tissue usually have blood vessels and nerves in them, but cartilage does not. Cartilage does not have any blood vessels, and cartilage does not have any nerves. So cartilage feels no pain, and it doesn't bleed, and it's tough as rubber. So it's a really good thing to have for painless, flexible support in your body. On the tops and bottoms of all your long bones, there's a pad of cartilage so that the bones in the joints don't touch each other and feel pain. It's a definite way to prevent that. You have cartilage in your nose, you have cartilage in your ear, any place where you can, you need some support, but you don't want it to be super hard like bone, and you don't want it to feel pain, and you don't want it to bleed. The cartilage, there's three types of them. The cartilage is covered by a membrane made of connective tissue and epithelium, which is what all these coverings and linings are made of. It's connective tissue, which is the squamous type connective tissue. Epithelium tissue, which is simple squamous, and then a layer of the areolar connective tissue too. So a combination of connective and epithelium make these coverings and linings of your body, like the puzzle. And so one type of it is called hyaline cartilage, and that's the most common kind. And that's the one that's found in the ends of your long bones, in your rib cage. Your ribs are not bone all the way to the front of your body. If it was, you wouldn't be able to breathe. So the end of your ribs are all made of cartilage, so it can stretch when you expand your chest. The larynx of your throat, the thing that's your voice box, is actually made of cartilage. Your trachea has to be held wide open because you have to breathe down into your lungs all the time, and you have to have that wide open, except when it's covered by the epiglottis when you swallow. And that's held open by rings of cartilage. If you actually looked at a trachea, you'll see it looks like a tube with rings around it. And those rings are cartilage rings that are actually holding the trachea wide open so that the sticky lining of the trachea, which is, remember, the pseudostratified epithelium cells, are making this mucus. If the trachea wasn't held open, it would stick together and you wouldn't be able to breathe. That's why you can kill somebody very easily by choking them. Elastic cartilage is just the same thing, except it has a lot more of the fibers type of not fibers. I'm sorry, elastic type of fibers in it, and so it itches really well. And that's the kind that's in your ear, so you can stretch your ear out and it boings right back to its regular shape. And same thing with the tip of your nose and the actual body of the epiglottis, the thing that actually closes the trachea when you swallow. Fibrocartilage, strongest kind, lots and lots and lots of collagen. They're the ones that are found in the discs between your vertebrae. The last thing you want is those vertebrae to touch each other, because if you don't know it, bones feel pain. Just hit yourself with a hammer somewhere on your head or on your shin, and you'll find that out pretty quickly. Bones feel pain, and so you want the vertebrae not to touch each other in your back. So what happens is that between each vertebra in your backbone, you have a disc made of cartilage, fibrocartilage. And so that since the cartilage feels no pain and doesn't bleed, it gives you a good way to make sure that these vertebrae aren't killing you when you move. Also in your knees, you want the fibrocartilage because, again, the knee takes a lot of pain and work on it. And between the pubic bones, the two bones that form your pelvis actually are on either side of your skeleton, and when you walk, they rub against each other. The two pubic bones in front of uh, your hips. And so what happens is that you have to have a pad of cartilage in there in order for that not to hurt. So when you're walking, your pelvis is actually rubbing against, one side is rubbing against the other side, and there's a pad of cartilage in between there so that you don't feel the pain. So you have three kinds of cartilage: hyaline, elastic, and fibro. And all of them are basically the same thing. They're covered by the perichondrium, which is the covering around the cartilage pad, made of blood vessel, made of connective tissue and epithelium, which, by the way, does have blood vessels in it. That's why your ear does bleed if you poke your ear to make a hole in it, because it's the skin and the covering of the cartilage that bleeds, not the cartilage itself. And now, getting to the last part, the bone. Bone is called osseous tissue, and instead of saying that the cartilage is covered by a perichondrium membrane, you say that the bone is covered by a periosteum membrane. Osteo means bone. And inside the bone, you have cells called osteocytes, or bone cells. They're alive. But in between the cells, the matrix, instead of being a sort of a rubbery protein, kind of like a pencil eraser, like it is with cartilage, it's a solid, almost like a rock. It's almost like limestone. It's made of calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate salts, and extremely hard. It's just basically a rock. And so you have a connective tissue here because the cells are not connected, but the matrix between them, besides having some collagen and elastin fibers in it, is filled with these salts, these calcium salts that are very, very, very hard. And that gives your bone, of course, the ability to give you a skeleton and give you support so you can walk and do all the things you do with your bones. There's a lot of blood vessels in bones and nerves. So bones bleed. If you broke a bone, blood would actually be coming out of the bone, and it would hurt a whole lot. And each bone is covered by a periosteum, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Our next couple of lessons are skin and bones, so we'll talk more about them when we get there. The periosteum is just a covering around each bone. It's reddish in color because it's made of a combination of epithelium and connective tissue. The connective tissue is the areolar kind, which has blood vessels in it. And so it's nice and red, and also nerves too. All right, so osseous tissue, obviously, all the bones of your skeleton and your middle ear. You have three little bones that help your ear work. Obviously, it supports your entire body, protects organs, like you have your ribs that protect your heart and your lungs. Transmits sound. That's what those three bones do in your ear. And it's also a source of calcium. That means that if your body is low in calcium, you have cells that could actually dissolve some of your bones. Not completely, but dissolve some of the calcium out of your bones to replace the calcium in your blood and your body, because the calcium is absolutely necessary for life. Even your heartbeat wouldn't work without calcium. So if you have low calcium in your diet, your body will take it from your bone matrix, those calcium salts between the cells. And also, all your blood cells, white blood cells and red blood cells, are made inside your bones. And we'll talk about that again later on. This is a picture of what cartilage looks like. You can see the cells are far apart in those little spaces called lacunae. And there's all that purple is the rubbery matrix in between it, all made of protein, like a super thick jello. And the lines are the collagen and elastin fibers embedded in it. And if you look at it, there's no blood vessels or nerves in there. Painless, flexible support. And then the little piece of bone I have there in the picture is just there to show you that the bone cells are not connected, hence their connective tissue. And they're embedded in this sort of stony or white-looking material, which is kind of like a rock. And it basically is limestone. It's calcium carbonate and calcium phosphate salts. Literally hard as a rock. And so that's osseous tissue or bone, also a connective tissue. Now, lastly, I said we'll talk a little bit about muscles and nerves at the end. and we'll have another period just on muscles and another one on nerves later on. But there's three kinds of muscles in your body, three kinds of muscle tissue. One kind is called striated, another kind is called cardiac, and the third kind is called smooth. Striated cells mean the cells have lines on them. Striations are lines. A zebra is a striated animal. And so if you look at the cells, they're very long, almost like a worm. In fact, one cell can go from one end of a muscle all the way to the other end of it and just still be one cell. Very, very long cells. They're microscopically thin, but they're that long. And because so long, they could have many nuclei in them. This is what they call a multinucleate cell. There's many, many nuclei, all of which have the genes and the DNA and the chromosomes in them. And the striated muscle, by and large, is muscle that you find in voluntary muscles. These are muscles that you use when you decide to. These would be the muscles that move your legs and your arms, and the one I'm using right now to talk to you with. These are voluntary muscles. So striated can be called voluntary. Striated can be called striated because of the lines. And then you go to cardiac. Now, cardiac muscle also has some striations or some lines on them. And by the way, those lines have a purpose, but we'll talk about them when we talk about muscles and how they work in a couple of weeks. Cardiac muscle, the cells are branchy, and you can see there's branches there. And you also notice there's little red spots. The red spots are called intercalated discs. And what they do is they speed the impulse across the muscle cells. So every cell gets the message to contract a lot faster than it would happen in striated muscles or voluntary muscles. The cardiac muscle, therefore, is much more efficient. And on top of that, it never gets tired. Striated muscle gets tired, as you know. But cardiac muscle, it beats for 80, 90 years, probably more than once per second, and never gets tired. It's an amazing thing. The intercalated discs speed the impulse across the heart muscles very quickly, so the right side and the left side of the heart beat at the same time. It really is an amazing thing, and we'll talk about the heart a lot more when we have the cardiovascular system later on. But cardiac muscle it's one cell. Each cell has its own nucleus. It's only one nucleus per cell. It has those intercalated discs which speed up the impulse across the heart, and it's branchy, and it never gets tired. Except maybe when you're 90 and you get your heart kind of gives out on you. And then you have smooth muscle. Smooth muscle looks nothing like striated muscle. Smooth muscle is involuntary muscle. It happens without your knowledge. And what it's doing is it's subconsciously controlling your organs. Smooth muscle, the cells are very small. They don't have any lines, hence the word smooth. One cell, one nucleus per cell, and they look like little, like little spindles. And they are in your stomach. They're the muscle that's in your stomach, the muscle that's in your intestines, the muscles that are in your esophagus, and those that actually squeeze the food along as it's going through your digestive system. You don't want to think about doing that. And so it's all automatic. You have a smooth muscle in a lot of places where you don't want to consciously do the job. You want it to sort of unconsciously happen. So when you start peeing, for example, the lining of your, the muscle in your bladder is smooth muscle, and it will literally squeeze the pee out for you, and you don't have to do anything yourself, except basically get it started. When a woman has a baby, the uterus is smooth muscle. When she has contractions, the smooth muscle is trying to push the baby out, and she has no control over that. It's automatic. So smooth muscle is automatic muscle, involuntary muscle, which is throughout your body in places where you want things to happen without your knowledge or without your ability to be aware of it. So that it just kind of happens for you. For nervous tissue, the last kind, we have two kinds of cells in there. Neurons are the actual cells that conduct the impulses. They're the wires. They are almost miraculous in what they do. Again, we'll talk about how they work in a couple of weeks. But just know for now that neuron cells are the actual wires that connect your brain and spinal cord to all the other parts of your body, so that you could have absolute control over every single muscle and all the endocrine glands and everything else that your body is doing, so that you're not out of control. Um, your brain is mostly neurons. The neuroglial cells are support cells. They're the ones in your nervous system that actually help the neurons out. They don't do the conduction of impulses and send messages to your muscles or anything like that. What they do is they clean the cells, the neurons. If any bacteria, viruses are on them, they'll eat them up, and so the neurons will stay nice and clean. They can wrap themselves around the neuron to protect them. They can attach the neurons onto other muscles and bones and blood vessels and things, so they don't flop around inside your body as a wire. So they're helper outers. They're necessary, but they're helper outers. Neurons lose the ability to do mitosis. So if you damage your neurons, it's very, very difficult to have that get fixed, because the neurons will not replace themselves. The neuroglial cells, however, can do mitosis. And so if you have a brain is probably about close to 50-50 neurons and neuroglial cells. The neurons are not going to create a brain tumor because they can't do mitosis. They can't grow out of control. But neuroglial cells can. And so one of those support cells might get crazy and start replicating and cause a tumor inside your brain. So that's the nervous system or nervous tissue. And this is what they look like. A neuroglial cell could be looks like a little amoeba sometimes. And what it does, it just floats around inside your nervous system, eating anything that is trying to damage your neurons. Or if you look at the motor neuron over here, you see it looks like a little wire. And these little sort of rectangles that are around it, those are neuroglial cells wrapped around the neuron to protect it and insulate it from other neurons. So it's kind of like the rubber on the outside of your wires. That's the nervous tissue. Now, this is just another example of nervous tissue. Now, remember those membranes I was telling you about? Whenever you have epithelial lining or covering, no matter what kind of epithelium it is, you have always some connective tissue under it. It's always a combination of epithelium and connective. In between them is that basement membrane, which is the glue that holds the puzzle pieces onto the cardboard underneath. The meninges are the connective tissue and epithelial membranes that collectively cover your brain and spinal cord. So your brain is actually wrapped in these connective tissue membranes, half epithelium, half connective. If you get them infected, clearly you have meningitis. The perichondrium is the membrane that covers your cartilage pieces, also connective and epithelium combination. The periosteum is the membrane that covers your bones. That's why your bones look a little red when instead of white. Your synovial membranes are the ones that are inside your joints. They line the inside of joints, and they create a fluid that lubricates the joint called synovial fluid. Remember, some of those epithelial cells have lots of Golgi, and so they can produce these fluids. The peritoneum is the connective and epithelium membrane that is covering or lining your abdomen, and also goes forward right in front of your backbone and wraps around your organs to hold them there. So you have a parietal portion of that, the edges, and the visceral one that goes around the organs and holds them in place. The pleurae do the same thing in your chest for your lungs. And then the pericardium is the connective and epithelium membranes that are surrounding your heart. All right, so that's basically it for tissues. And that'll be it for this particular recording. So remember to do your homework. Watch out for those deadlines. Remember, your homework assignments are going to be part of, when they add it up at the end, they're going to be your final exam grade, 20 points. So don't forget to do them. There's going to be a tissue one this week, and I'll send you an email and an announcement on Blackboard about what to do with that. Okay, so have a nice week, and we'll see you next time around.